Welcome to Philosophy 220. Today's video will cover the philosophers in Unit 3, Early Modern Philosophy. Starting with the philosopher David Hume, we will look at his theory of ethics, taking note that his theory is integrated into his overall philosophical approach based on empiricism, which is the idea that the deliveries of the senses are our only source of knowledge, his interest and enthusiasm in the emergence of science, and an idea called naturalism, which means our philosophical theories should be consistent with the findings of science. For David Hume, this also means some skepticism about human nature as 100% rational. Hume gives us a descriptive account about why certain characteristics and certain actions are labeled by us as good or bad. For him, what makes actions good or bad has to do with what he calls sentiment, or our feelings. This means he's arguing against the idea that our moral judgments are based entirely on reason. Rather, he claims that reason can only make determinations about what he calls matters of fact, that is, truths about the state of the physical world. Sometimes we can also make true claims about how ideas relate to each other, but moral judgments don't qualify as either of these. So simply making a claim about the state of the world does not imply a moral conclusion. Most importantly, Hume points out that moral reasoning and being a moral agent is a peculiarly human endeavor. In other words, we don't make moral judgments about animals and inanimate objects. Thus, all of our actions are motivated by character traits. We have the character traits such as charity, for example, kindness, honesty, benevolence, those types of things. Moreover, your action has an effect on others who are also moral agents. When you think about your act, you'll also think about what the impact will be on the other person. Then we judge our actions based on how we would look at them were we non-interested third parties. So for example, you'll get an agreeable feeling at the observation of, say, benevolence. Somebody gives a hungry person food, even if we're not party to that interaction, we'll have an agreeable feeling about that behavior. So the sympathetic feelings of pleasure are my moral approval. So things that we feel good about are morally good, things that we feel badly about are morally bad. What's really interesting about Hume's theory is that he thinks that, for the most part, we're pretty uniform about the things that make us feel good and the things that make us feel bad. Thus, if you saw somebody, say, abusing a child or an animal, even if you're not party to it and you don't know anyone who's in the situation, you would feel bad about your experience, about watching that happen. That's because we sympathize with each other. You see the emotion of another, and a mirror image of the emotion is created in you. Moreover, Hume claims that we can't act in self-interest alone. We certainly do act in our self-interest. In fact, we would be in deep trouble if we didn't do so. But we also act frequently in the interests of others. with no benefit to ourselves. Sometimes we even act against our self-interest for the benefit of others. And the reason that we do that is because we have the moral sentiment. We have the moral feelings about certain kinds of actions. Thus, reason is not the source of morality. It's sentiments, and sentiments come from self-love and sympathy. So we have our own emotions, and we also can, via sympathy, feel the emotions of others. This is part and parcel of the human condition. We have this emotional life, and that's what allows us to engage in moral reasoning. Thus, the reason that we act morally, if you were to ask the question, why should we do what's morally right? We feel approval about good acts. We feel disapproval about bad acts. When we think about our acts from a third-person point of view, we can judge ourselves and our own actions. And we apply the same standards to ourselves that we do to others. His argument is based on what we observe about ourselves. We have feelings of sympathy, sharing in the emotions of others, and we have feelings of self-love. Moreover, what's morally good is also useful. Therefore, when we act morally, it pleases us and it pleases others. And the character traits that forward that kind of behavior are considered to be morally good. Justice is morally good, therefore we ought to be just. There are some consequences of his view. It means that we must rely on our being fairly uniform in the human condition, that most of us are more or less the same when it comes to feelings of either approbation or blame. And that consistency, in part at least, arises from habituation. It would give a good explanation for why there's some cultural variation, for example. When we disagree, or when, for example, people act acratically or amorally, probably that's happening because the actor is only looking at her own situation and not looking at the general view. Our sentiments are only accurate when we take up the general point of view. Next, we'll talk about the ethics of Immanuel Kant, arguably one of the most influential ethicists in the Western tradition. His claim is that ethics, when we think about what we must do, we're looking for a system of rules. And it's rules and rules alone that give actions their moral status. That means that the consequences of the actions don't make them good or bad in and of themselves. It's that kind of action. So some kinds of behavior are inherently morally bad, such as lying, stealing, murder, that type of thing. This means that moral rules are more than just the outcropping of character, they're commands. Kant believes that this is superior to something like Hume's theory because the sentiments can have some variation. But if the system of morality is grounded in reason, it's going to be consistent all the time. Therefore, whatever the underlying rational basis is of our belief that an action should be done, that is going to be why it ought to be done. So what that means is that there's an aspect of the human psyche which Kant refers to as the good will. So will in the sense that we have freedom of the will, for example. The only time we act in a truly moral fashion is when we're acting completely out of the goodwill, because the goodwill only acts from duty, not just in conformity with the duty, but the reason that it acts is the obligation. A famous example of his is the difference between a grocer who gives correct change because it's the right thing to do, as opposed to another grocer who gives the correct change so as not to get caught or to alienate her customers, etc. The grocer who's giving correct change in order to avoid a bad consequence is acting in conformity with duty, but is not acting from duty itself. And so her action is not moral in nature. Again, moral obligation or moral duty is the best motive because it's consistent. The consequences of our actions might change, our feelings might change, culture might change, there's a great deal of variation, but what won't change is the principle that's recognized by reason. It also means that moral agents must also be rational agents, meaning that a person must be rational in order to be capable of being praised or blamed for her actions. When Kant talks about rules, he very often uses the phrase imperatives. A moral imperative is one that applies to everyone, universally, no exceptions. On the other hand, a hypothetical imperative is a practical claim about how to achieve a particular goal. The list of moral imperatives come from the basic concept that Kant calls the categorical imperative. It is the moral law itself. Any agent who is acting simply because reason tells her it is the right thing to do is acting on the categorical imperative. One way Kant thinks about the categorical imperative is what we call the universal law formula. Thus, when we consider a particular action, suppose you're thinking to yourself, I will return something that I borrowed. We have to ask ourselves, what's the reason for it? Is this course of action something that applies universally? One way to test for that is to imagine if your action were to become a universal law. Can you will that your proposed course of action were to become a universal law and that everyone must behave in such a way? If you're cheating on an exam, probably not. If you're planning to return something that you borrowed, then we can will for that to be a universal law, and therefore it's a moral imperative. Two ways in which an item can fail the universal law is that it's either impossible, it's logically impossible, or what he would call a contradiction in will, something that clearly contradicts moral sensibilities. So, for example, could we will that people were to be euthanized at the age of 50 in order to conserve resources? Maybe there's a good outcome there, which of course wouldn't matter to Kant, but killing everybody at 50 is just clearly morally impermissible. There's also what we call the formula of the end in itself. Here Kant says we should always act in such a way that we always treat humanity never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. What he means by that is that persons should be treated as important and good in their own right. Thus, a person, a moral agent, should never be used merely in the same way that we use inanimate objects, for example. We should never use people. The reason for this is that human moral agents command respect because of their capacity for reason. We'll finish up with a discussion of the moral theory known as utilitarianism. In a utilitarian view, what makes an action morally good or bad is its outcome, and only its outcome. In other words, the intentions of the actions don't give it its moral status. The outcome does. We'll be talking both about Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Mill was, in fact, Bentham's protege, so their views are on a continuum with one another. Bentham is best known for his idea that utility is pleasure, disutility is pain, and that we should judge what we decide to pursue, say, for example, institutions. Institutions that promote the overall well-being are those that we should pursue because they're the most useful. A significant difference between utilitarianism and other forms of hedonism is that we measure the amount of pleasure or happiness over the entire group, over all of humanity, as opposed to our own individual pleasure. Say, for example, as you had with Epicurus. Thus, our actions should be judged by their usefulness in promoting the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. Notice that this is going to have social implications, and true to form, Jeremy Bentham was very influential in social policies, such as court reform, prison reform, expanding voter suffrage, etc. That means that utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. Consequentialism is any theory who determines the moral value of actions based on their outcomes. Now, those outcomes may vary. Utilitarianism in particular is looking for usefulness understood by Bentham, for example, as physical pleasure. By Mill, as you're going to see, he's going to introduce a concept that he calls happiness. Of course, Mill and Bentham are not the only utilitarians. In fact, there are many contemporary philosophers who are also utilitarians. When you write your paper for this class, for example, one of the paper topics is about the work of Peter Singer, who is a contemporary utilitarian philosopher. One way to think about utilitarianism is what we call act consequentialism, which is that we judge particular individual acts in their context for what their total outcome is going to be. Then what we say is the actions that are morally obligatory are going to be those that produce the greatest amount of pleasure or happiness for the greatest number of people. Thus, not only do we want to promote the greatest amount of pleasure, but we also want to produce the least amount of pain possible as well. According to Bentham, pleasure and pain are the only things that spur us to action, and then the only things that make an action right or wrong. Thus, the moral command is that we should act always so as to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, we may want to take a minute to think about that. How do we know? How do we know what our actions are doing? If I have $20, I might spend my $20 on a meal for myself, or else I could give my $20 to the food bank. Which one's a better action? Well, more people are going to have pleasure because they're going to be able to eat from my $20 if I give it to the food bank than if I just go out and buy a meal for just me. The meal for me isn't bad necessarily because it's a good, right? It's pleasure that I'm deriving for myself, but that same $20 could be used to produce more pleasure for the greatest number. What makes utilitarianism a little counterintuitive is that each individual person's pleasure counts only as much as any other individual person. Thus, just because you would maybe derive a very great amount of pleasure from a particular action, that amount of pleasure doesn't make it more valuable than it would be for another person. So sometimes a great amount of pleasure for a single person is morally impermissible if it will cause pain for many people, for example. There's some other items that you can use to think about particular actions. How intense is the pleasure or pain that's going to ensue? How long will it last? Ones that last for a very long time, say pleasures or pains, are going to weigh more heavily than those that would be very, very short-lived. Propinquity is about the remoteness in time. So for example, it may be hard for us to think about the outcomes of our actions that'll be 100 years from now, particularly if we're most likely to be dead. However, on a utilitarian point of view, future people matter just as much as current people. So if our actions are going to make life very painful for future people, then we shouldn't commit those actions. Purity is also one you may want to think about. Most pleasures are mixed. So there may be some things that are pleasant, but they come mixed with some measure of pain as well. So for example, cake is delicious, but it's also going to come with pain that results from its impact on our health. We might get too much sugar in our systems and then feel bad after eating the cake. We may find that making a cake is wasteful when we could have used the same ingredients to make a more nutritious food, for example. Bentham believes that utilitarianism is the best theory because we can talk about it in a clear and intelligible way. It's non-coercive in the sense that you're not telling people that they're bad, you're only talking about this action and these outcomes. We can have evidence about what the outcomes are going to be or very likely to be, and it can guide collective action in the real world. He thinks that these are so valuable that it puts utilitarianism in a better light than other theories. Mill, on the other hand, who again was a protege of Bentham, so knew his work backwards and forwards, went on to continue the tradition of utilitarianism, but to change it somewhat. Mill was a proponent of individual freedom as well as utilitarian social policies. So for example, he thought that the equality of women was required from a utilitarian standpoint, precisely because the pain or pleasure that is experienced by women is no more or less important than those of their male counterparts. His utilitarianism, however, is different than Bentham's because Mill thinks that the principle of utility is something more than just mere physical pleasure or the avoidance of physical pain. He wants happiness to include higher pleasures. So it will include the lower pleasures. So if you're hungry and you eat a healthy meal, that will be morally good because that's a pleasure. But the learning experience that you have from reading a good book is a higher pleasure because it's an intellectual pleasure. So our higher pleasures, friendship, knowledge, the ability to develop as an individual, as a human being, these things only humans are capable of, and they're of a higher quality than the lower pleasures. You can see, though, that utilitarianism has had an impact over the years. Say, for example, the concept of the public library is something that is a product of utilitarian policies. The public library allows for many, many people to have access to books and information, and now other things, technical devices, for example. And it brings out a better outcome than simply having individuals own books because only they get to read the books. In the public library, the books are available to a greater number of people. Mill's utilitarianism can be capsulized into what we call the greatest happiness principle. So actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to promote the reverse. So for example, the public library is a good thing because it tends to promote happiness in greater measure, whereas something that produces the reverse of happiness, so that would be either not having access to the intellectual pleasures or causing physical pain or the diminution of physical pleasure, would bring about actions that are wrong. So the pleasures that are higher are those which ought to be pursued in the greatest measure. But notice, he doesn't write off the lower pleasures entirely. So Mill would think, for example, that providing services to people who are food insecure is a good thing because having the needs of the body taken care of allows for individuals to pursue the higher pleasures. But it's not in itself the whole end of the goal. So we should address hunger on a worldwide level, but in addition to that, we should also try to make information available to everybody, for example. Moreover, Mill thinks that the higher pleasures should be highlighted, that our actions should aim at those higher pleasures because those capacities are what make us human. From your selection in Mill's On Liberty, we have another principle which some people have argued is incompatible with the greatest happiness principle. In On Liberty, Mill examines under what circumstances it's morally legitimate for the state, and by that he means the government, to intervene in a person's life. A view that's called paternalism argues that the state is justified in intervening when it's needed to benefit or prevent harm to people, meaning themselves. So for example, we have laws against certain controlled substances. In this case, the state is saying, you can't possess these or you can't use these because we think it's bad for you. Of course, Mill is neither an anarchist either, because he doesn't believe that the state is never morally legitimate in compelling people to act. He thinks that there's plenty of reasons for the state to act in such a way to compel our behavior. And so here's how we determine when it is or isn't legitimate. The state is justified in intervening in a person's life, but only when that person is acting in a way that is harmful to others than herself. What that means is that a person's actions that causes harm to herself doesn't justify governmental intervention. Mill believes that individual autonomy ought to be preserved as much as possible, so long as we're preserving a social order and keeping people from being harmed. That means that not every case of harm is going to warrant government intervention. So for example, if your next door neighbor paints her house hot pink, depending on what the laws are around you, that may not warrant government intervention. So every case of harm may not warrant it, but it is a necessary condition for intervention. So if the government makes a law or enforces a law that polices individual behavior, individual action, then there has to be some kind of harm to someone else for that to be legitimate. In other cases, sometimes intervention may be impractical. So for example, if you were to look at whether or not boyfriends and girlfriends cheat on each other, that would be too impractical for the state to intervene in. So the cheater's behavior is harming the other person. The cheater's behavior is harming the other boyfriend or girlfriend. But because it would be so difficult and really would be impractical for the state to write laws and then have enforcement occur, that's not a place that's appropriate for the state to intervene. Again, harm can also be caused by action or inaction. So for example, if you refuse to serve on a jury, that's a kind of inaction. The state can compel you to do so. A pretty good example of looking at this is drunk driving. According to the harm principle, the state doesn't have a legitimate interest in telling you whether or not you can drink alcohol in your home. The individual has the right to determine for herself her course of action so long as it only affects her. But drunk driving is different because when people drive a car when they're intoxicated, they put other people at risk, and at a very significant risk at that. We could also talk about texting and driving, for example. The state probably shouldn't be able to tell you whether or not or how much you can text, but it can tell you that you can't text while you're driving a car because you're putting people at risk. And the incidence of morbidity and mortality are actually quite a bit higher with texting and driving even than it is with drunk driving. The harm doesn't always have to be physical necessarily. Physical harm to person. Clearly property damage is something that the state wants to mitigate. So you don't have the right to go onto somebody else's house or go into somebody else's property and set their house on fire because that causes harm to that other person. Psychological harm, it's a little bit different. When do we want to decide that certain psychological effects are so great that a person's behavior ought to be curtailed? Mill thought that this could be tempered by considering the importance of the freedom of thought and discussion. He's got 4 reasons for why it's so important. 1, if we repress expression, we might be suppressing truths. However, even if they're falsehoods, people should be able to exchange the ideas so that they can reasonably think through arguments for and against positions. Additionally, free expression of dissent encourages people to think rationally about what they believe. And sometimes there may be a kernel of truth in some overall systems that may themselves be false.